People who cheated on their partner. Why did you do it? Welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Story 1. Simply put, my partner was unfaithful, and I ended up doing the same in return. I was 22 when it all started and am now 30. The story gets more intense. Back then, I worked as a pizza delivery guy. One day, after a shift, I came home with chocolates and flowers for my partner. We'd been together for 5 years by that point, only to find her with someone else in our bed. I quietly stood at the bedroom door, witnessing everything, and neither of them noticed me. Devastated, I left the apartment and went to a friend's house to calm down. He suggested I should confront her, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Hours later, I went back home, gave her the chocolates and flowers, and acted as though nothing was wrong. Looking back, I realized I was just trying to rationalize everything. Later that evening, she left for a night shift as a security guard. After she left, I sat alone for hours, feeling heartbroken. Around 10 p.m., our roommate, who was also my partner's best friend, called me to help her with her car. I sorted out the car issue and got her back to the house. Once home, she made dinner and we ate together. I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd seen earlier in the day. In the middle of the night, around 3 a.m., I had a complete emotional breakdown. The roommate noticed, came over, and comforted me. She pulled my head into her lap and stayed with me while I cried until I eventually fell asleep. The next day, I kept everything to myself again, holding in my emotions. After my partner left for work, I sat down and wrote a letter about how I felt and the betrayal I'd witnessed. When the roommate got home, she sensed something was wrong, so I finally told her everything. She was stunned, staying silent for a while. Then, surprisingly, she offered to help me get back at my partner by, doing it with her. It wasn't something I planned to act on, but in that vulnerable moment, I did. That night changed everything. Early the next morning, an argument broke out between my partner and the roommate after the roommate confronted her about the cheating. Tempers flared, and the argument turned physical. The neighbors heard the commotion and called the police, leading to both women getting arrested. Later that day, the roommate's mother bailed her out, and my partner came by with her family to collect her belongings, including the bed. She told me she was ending things, and I agreed. Fast forward about 8 months. The roommate and I welcomed a daughter together. During her hospital stay, I thought I saw my ex in the parking lot, but I brushed it off. A few months later, I received papers requesting a paternity test, and I found out I was also the father of my ex's child, born the day before my daughter. After a custody case, I now pay child support and have visitation with my son twice a month. I'm also married to the roommate, and we've built a life together with our daughter and son. I did indeed feel like a jerk how that whole incident unfolded, but I wouldn't change it for anything in the world. A little advice: communication in a relationship is key, and if you don't want babies, use protection. Also, don't cheat, it's just not good. Story 2. I cheated because I genuinely had no idea what a healthy or functional relationship looked like. I ended up in a cycle I had seen too often. My parents were married for almost 30 years, but the cycle of infidelity began well before I was born. My grandma would even tell me stories about being friends with my grandpa's other girlfriends, saying she wasn't toxic or jealous like other women. In the relationship where I was unfaithful, I was treated poorly. I was financially supporting both of us, despite being 10 years younger and working as a waitress, and enduring constant mistreatment from someone who was struggling deeply. I felt stuck in the same cycle I'd watched my mom and grandma live through, not fully understanding what a healthier option looked like. Then a guy at work started showing me attention, and I enjoyed it. He was kind, poetic, and thoughtful, helping his sister raise his niece, working hard, and staying away from the habits that drained my paycheck and wrecked my home. What started as innocent work banter quickly grew into something deeper, and before I knew it, I found myself in a full-blown affair. I was preparing myself to leave my boyfriend for this new partner when I discovered my boyfriend had been unfaithful to me as well, with anyone he could meet online, even using my money to fund his actions. Any guilt I felt for my own actions vanished in that moment. I packed up my things and went straight to my new partner's house, ready to begin fresh. But when I arrived, I found he had someone else over and admitted that much of what he had told me was only because he thought I'd never actually leave. In the end, it was a painful experience. If you're unhappy in your relationship, put in the effort to either improve it or leave. That new person will have their own flaws. They won't fix you or complete you. Only you can do that. I moved back home with my parents, witnessed some more of their drama, which inspired me to actually break the cycle. I'm now happily and faithfully married to a great man. My self-work inspired my mom to finally leave my dad. Hopefully everyone will keep getting better from here. Story 3. Because my wife told me she was no longer interested in intimacy with me. She also didn't want me seeking it elsewhere and forbade me from finding alternatives like watching content online or even self-relief. I still occasionally did the latter, but we couldn't discuss it without upsetting her. So, to meet my needs outside of our relationship, for several years, I visited someone for a discreet massage a few times each year. Although this was still a form of infidelity, I rationalized it as the mildest form possible. No risk of health issues, no risk of any unintended consequences, and no emotional attachment. I knew it was wrong, but at the time, it seemed like my best choice out of difficult options. Looking back, I realized I should have just said, I want a divorce from the start. That's where we ended up anyway, and it would have saved both me, my wife, and our children from needless pain. By hiding my actions, I only made it worse when she eventually found out. To anyone in a similar situation, I would say, in the relationship, if you feel the need to step out, if you're resorting to secrecy, it's a sign you're not happy. Save yourself and your partner from further harm, and make the hard decision now before it escalates. Story 4. Because I was still emotionally attached to my ex, when she reached out to reconnect, I didn't value my new relationship enough to set the right boundaries. I let myself cross a line I deeply regret and never plan to cross again. In that moment, I convinced myself it was harmless, but the reality hit hard afterward. The weight of that decision stayed with me for years, leaving a sense of regret and guilt that was difficult to shake. No matter how much you try to justify it to yourself at the time, choices like this leave a lasting impact, not only on the people involved, but also on your own peace of mind. I've learned that staying true to your commitments and setting firm boundaries is essential if you want to build something meaningful. If you're ever tempted to take a similar risk, know that it's really not worth it. Story 5. It all started when I had one too many drinks one night and ended up at a party where I was being hit on by a very flexible yoga teacher. She was charming and confident, and in my drunken state, I was caught up in the attention. The chemistry was undeniable, and I didn't stop to think about the consequences. To make things worse, I ended up getting caught later that same day. The whole situation quickly spiraled into chaos. What seemed like a harmless encounter at the time turned into an absolute mess, with emotions running high and everything unraveling before I could even process what was happening. It was a total disaster from start to finish, one I never imagined would play out the way it did. Story 6. The reason I ended up making that terrible decision was because she cheated on me first. I felt completely betrayed, and in that moment, I thought I needed to get back at her. I convinced myself that it was justified, that I deserved to feel in control again, to retaliate somehow. But looking back now, I realized just how wrong that thinking was. I don't ever recommend making that kind of decision. It's a stupid, impulsive reaction that doesn't bring any real satisfaction. In fact, it only makes things worse. It's not worth it, folks. Before that, I prided myself on being stoic, on not letting my emotions control my actions. Now, I find myself without a solid foundation to stand on. I don't have a leg to stand on when it comes to trying to justify what I did. And honestly, it wasn't worth it. Story 7. I stayed in a marriage that made me miserable for far too long. I was too afraid to make the tough decision to get a divorce, and too proud to admit that I needed help by going to therapy to try and fix things. Instead, I made the worst choice possible. I cheated. Of course, I got caught, and the consequences of that mistake have stayed with me. Since then, I've done a lot of self-reflection and spent a lot of time in therapy trying to understand why I made those choices. Now, I'm finally in the process of getting a divorce. Even though I'm happy to have that relationship behind me, I will always regret cheating. It's the biggest mistake of my life, and no matter what I've learned or how much I've grown since then, I can't undo it. Story 8. This happened about 20 years ago with an ex. I was 22, just figuring things out as a young gay man, and he was around 40 at the time. The age gap between us was always something that made me uncomfortable. I had a lot of doubts about the relationship, and honestly, I struggled with it more than I wanted to admit. We actually broke up a couple of times because of it, but each time, we ended up getting back together. By the time this particular incident happened, we'd been together for about 4 months. One night, I was out at a club with some friends, and I realized that if I kept doubting the relationship, it probably meant I wasn't okay with it. I made up my mind to break up with him, but since he wasn't with me that night, I decided I'd tell him the next day. But since I was already at the club and had made up my mind to end things, I thought it wouldn't matter if I met someone new, and that's exactly what happened. I ended up kissing one of the club dancers, and we went back to his place where we spent the night together. The next morning, when the alcohol wore off and I had time to think, I realized that I didn't actually want to break up with my boyfriend. What made it worse was that I'd also just cheated on him. I felt awful about it, so I called him later that day, told him everything while I was crying, and fully expected him to break up with me. To my surprise, his response was nothing like what I had expected. He asked me to meet him somewhere public, where he gave me a gift and told me he understood. He said that he knew I was struggling with the relationship, and that things like this just happen sometimes. I was confused by his reaction, especially because I thought he'd be angry or upset with me. We stayed together for a few more months after that, but eventually he broke up with me. Looking back, I can't really blame him. By then, I was just a mess of emotions and confusion. I ran into him a few times at parties after that, that, and he was always kind and polite to me, which I truly appreciated. Despite everything that happened, he never stopped being nice to me. Story 9. I formed an emotional connection with someone that felt deeper than anything I had ever experienced before. Looking back, I realized it was one of the most foolish and regretful decisions I've ever made. It wasn't worth the consequences I now face. I've lost my entire family and the respect of the people who matter most to me. If I could go back, I would never make that choice again. I gave up everything for something that ultimately didn't matter, and I had everything I needed right in front of me. I just couldn't see it at the time. Story 10. I struggled with insecurity, a poor self-image, and an inability to put aside my ego to honor my morals. I had been bullied throughout school, which left me feeling depressed and angry. When I started receiving attention from women after school, I went overboard. My ego grew out of control. I lied about where I was, deleted text messages, created fake accounts, thinking I was being clever. I thought I was getting away with it, but I wasn't. She always knew. They always find out. I've changed a lot since then, and thankfully, we're still together, but it hasn't been easy. There are moments when I see the pain in her eyes, and I wish I could undo everything. But at the same time, I don't think I would be who I am today if I hadn't gone through that experience. It took a lot for me to realize the kind of person I had become. One morning, I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back at me. It felt like an out-of-body experience, and I hated who I saw. Since then, I've worked hard to become better, and I make sure to tell her every day that I love her, that I'm hers as long as she'll have me. But if she were to tell me tomorrow that she was done, I wouldn't blame her. She's my best friend, and she's helped me grow more than I could have imagined. She's been patient with me, way more than she ever had to be. If I could go back in time with the wisdom I have now, I would, just to spare her from the hurt and doubt I know is still lingering in the back of her mind. She doesn't deserve that pain. Story 11. I did it because I wanted to be with someone new, plain and simple. It wasn't about revenge or dissatisfaction with my partner. I just had the chance to explore a different experience and took it. Story 12. He was controlling and emotionally abusive, constantly threatening me and calling me crazy for voicing my concerns, especially when he cheated multiple times. We'd have endless conversations about my feelings, but nothing changed. The hardest part was that he had a child I'd grown very attached to, and I knew that leaving would mean never seeing them again. When I finally tried to break up with him, it became a chaotic ordeal as he refused to leave me alone, creating a vicious cycle I struggled to break free from. In addition, he showed little interest in being close to me, likely because he was getting attention elsewhere, though we'd talked about that issue many times as well. Throughout that relationship, I spent so much time in therapy, trying to make sense of it all and find some peace. Then I met someone who treated me with respect. He never lied. He was there whenever I needed him, and I felt genuinely valued for the first time. I don't regret stepping away from my old relationship to be with him. I knew it hurt my ex, but it finally allowed me to break free. He tried to get me back, not out of love, but out of a desire to keep control. The most difficult moment was when he called me with his child on the line, which nearly broke me. But the person I'm with now supported me through it all, helping me through panic attacks and never making me feel wrong for my struggles. The relationship I left behind was a dark chapter in my life, but leaving it likely saved me. I've now been with the person I met for nearly a decade, and we've been married for 5 years. I've never been unfaithful again, and I'm grateful every day for the peace I've found. Story 13. When I was 18, I was immature, self-centered, and completely clueless about valuing people or considering their feelings. I wasn't truly in love. I was more caught up in the thrill of the experience than anything else. Sure, there were underlying issues and past traumas that contributed to my behavior, but that doesn't excuse it. I made a thoughtless, selfish mistake that could have hurt someone deeply, and honestly, I regret it. Thankfully, they never found out, and we eventually went our separate ways. They're living a happy life now with a family of their own, and I'm genuinely relieved that they never had to bear the pain I would have caused them if they'd known. Looking back, I'm incredibly frustrated with myself for risking the chance of damaging someone else so deeply just because I wasn't ready for commitment. It's a regret I've carried, but I'm glad they're doing well. Story 14. Her interest in intimacy had completely disappeared, and I knew that breaking up with her would disrupt her life in a huge way. She was an unemployed college student with no family support, and I was paying for everything. I had just graduated and was working full-time to cover our expenses. When I committed to handling the financial side of things, it was under the assumption that we were both fully invested in the relationship, including intimacy. I truly cared for her, enjoyed our time together, and didn't want to cause her hardship, especially mid-semester. Breaking up would have created so much chaos, and I wanted to protect the relationship in my own way. Every part of it was good except the lack of intimacy, and I was worried that holding on to resentment might risk putting us in a difficult or awkward place. I talked to her about my feelings, explaining that I wasn't prepared for a relationship without physical closeness. She opened up, sharing that her lack of desire was tied to her depression. I sympathized, but after 6 months, I felt like I'd reached a limit. In the country where we lived, visiting a professional was legal, so a couple of times a month, I went to a licensed establishment, taking necessary precautions and keeping the experiences discreet and professional. I know that choice wasn't noble or ideal, but at the time I saw it as the best way to keep things steady and not end the support she needed. If we had broken up, her rent would have been unaffordable, and her friends wouldn't have been in a position to help her financially or offer her a stable place to live. I never planned to make her leave, but I also couldn't expect her to be comfortable staying with me. I was doing my best to avoid resentment building up, especially when she said, "You can use my body, but I'm just not interested these days." I couldn't bring myself to go forward in that way, so I dropped the idea of intimacy entirely. I was young and honestly confused, but I thought this choice would be the least harmful. The relationship eventually came to an end. When I told her about it after she graduated, she said she understood and acknowledged that breaking up back then would have disrupted her life. We parted ways not long after, but I'm grateful we could have an honest conversation about it in the end. Story 15. I honestly never intended for things to turn out this way. But after spending 10 years in a relationship where my ex struggled deeply with mental health issues, I found myself completely checked out. Eventually, I met someone new, and that connection made me realize just how emotionally drained I had become. Ultimately, I ended up leaving my ex for my new partner. To give some background, for a decade, I supported my ex through repeated hospitalizations, suicide attempts, and constant crises, eventually becoming more of a caregiver than a partner. I felt like I was living as her unofficial case manager rather than being in a balanced relationship. In hindsight, I know I should have ended things as soon as I realized I had feelings for someone else, but I was genuinely afraid of how she would react. And, as it turned out, those fears weren't unfounded. Story 16. For over 15 years of marriage, I endured a lot physical, emotional, and psychological mistreatment. I stayed, mostly for the sake of our kids, even after being betrayed by my spouse 3 times. Each time, I chose to forgive and move forward. Then I met a friend who was everything I needed, kind, caring, empathetic. She offered the support and understanding I had longed for. We were friends for 5 years, both married, both dealing with our own struggles, with no intention of being more than that. But in that 6th year, as we confided in each other more deeply and shared our personal challenges, our connection grew stronger. It went from friendship to something more. We became each other's support and eventually each other's love. When her husband found out, everything came crashing down. I take full responsibility for my actions. I was at my lowest point. Do the years of pain or the need for connection excuse what I did? No, I made a choice, and I'll always own it. But I believe it's important to share the full story. Story 17. I was feeling depressed and miserable, stuck in a 6-year relationship where my ex was constantly pushing me away. There were times she was emotionally abusive, and though I felt unhappy, I stayed because I was scared of being alone. Eventually, I went on a social site, met an incredible woman, and started seeing her before officially ending things with my ex. In a way, I crossed the line twice in one situation, and I still carry a lot of guilt about that. My new girlfriend helped me find the confidence I needed to finally leave that relationship and focus on my happiness. If I could go back, I'd handle things more carefully and end it the right way first. But now, 6 months into this relationship, these have been some of the best months of my life, and I'm grateful for the fresh start. Story 18. For months, I was repeatedly accused of cheating, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. Then one night, after a party, she ended up sleeping in my best friend's bed. She swore nothing happened, but I couldn't bring myself to believe her and was already thinking about ending the relationship. Around that time, another woman who I thought was way out of my league came on to me. I figured, if I'm already being accused of cheating and feel like I'm probably being cheated on too, I might as well go through with it. We broke up not long after. Story 19. First time, I was young, overconfident, and drunk, thinking I was invincible. It was selfish and careless. Second time, this was with a different partner in a different situation. My boyfriend had cheated on me multiple times, and I knew about it, though he didn't know I knew. Out of frustration and immaturity, I ended up getting involved with someone else at a party. Third time, this is the one I regret the most. I had a situationship with someone I really wanted more from. It was painful, and I finally decided I needed to end it because it was hurting my heart to just stay friends with benefits. But then we hung out, had some drinks, and I ended up making a huge emotional plea about why we should be together, which I don't even remember. A week later, I ended up getting involved with someone else, thinking we were still casual. I regret it deeply. Even now, I can't help but think about him. Sometimes I feel like I see or smell him in random places. It feels like I lost something special, and I still carry the weight of that mistake. I haven't drunk that much since, and only drink on special occasions. I hope he's happy wherever he is. Being with him felt like I found something real, something that made me feel complete. I still remember the first time I saw him across the room. It was instant. I felt like I had to meet him. The lesson is clear. Don't take for granted the good things you have in your life. Story 20. After high school, I started a relationship with a girl who moved out of state for college, and we foolishly stayed together. Instead of breaking up, we lied and cheated on each other until we eventually stopped talking. Over the years, I've been cheated on 3 times in different relationships, and I realize now that it came down to the choices I made in partners. One of those situations I understand more clearly now. I was struggling with substance abuse, emotionally distant, and manipulative. I lied about using drugs, and she thought I was cheating, so she did the same. Thankfully, I got sober a few years later. While it was a painful experience, I'm grateful for it now because it helped me recognize harmful behaviors early on in others. Story 21. At the time, I thought the only issue in the relationship was that the sex wasn't great. Later, I realized that the real problem was a lack of attraction and poor communication. After we broke up, I made a promise to myself not to make those mistakes again, and I never cheated after that. Story 22. At the time, I didn't understand what I was doing, but looking back, I can see how wrong I was. I was young, just 18, fresh out of foster care, struggling with issues like abandonment and depression. I didn't understand my partner's love language or how deeply he truly cared for me. Even though I loved him with everything I had, I couldn't see his affection in the way he showed it. I loved him so much, but I was scared. I told myself, this is your first relationship. What are the odds it will last forever? I tried to convince myself it was just infatuation. But my feelings for him only grew stronger, and every time he came home, I was overwhelmed with joy. I'd count down the hours until he was back. It was almost a routine. I'd clean, cook, shower, and wait for him. But when he came home, he wasn't as excited as I was. He would play video games with his friends instead of talking to me, and I felt rejected. Despite everything I did to show my love for him, gifts, words of affirmation, acts of service, physical touch, he didn't respond the way I hoped. I convinced myself that if I didn't smother him, he wouldn't pull away. I tried to chill out and not be so emotional, thinking that maybe my behavior was pushing him away. I didn't have many close relationships outside of him, and I started to rely on someone at work to fill that emotional gap. I would text this coworker instead of reaching out to my boyfriend, using him as an outlet for my feelings. I wasn't physically or emotionally involved with him, but I was doing something wrong. One day, when my boyfriend asked to use my phone, I deleted the conversation with a coworker before handing it to him. But right before I did, the coworker sent a message and my boyfriend saw it. 2 days later, he ended things with me. For the past 7 years, I've carried the weight of that mistake. Now that I'm older, I understand how wrong I was. I realize how differently men show their love, and I see now how stressed he must have been, supporting us both on a low income. I didn't appreciate the quiet ways he expressed his love, like staying up late to watch movies with me, or how he wanted to be near me, even when life was tough for him. We weren't perfect. We were both young, trying to figure things out, and I was so blind to his struggles. I regret making him feel like he wasn't enough or that his efforts weren't seen. I now know that cheating leaves scars, both for the person who cheats and the person who's betrayed. The pain I caused him is something I'll carry with me forever. I'm lucky enough to still have him in my life as a good friend, and I am grateful every day. He will always be the love of my life. I've learned from my mistakes, and I will never put someone through that again. Please, if you can learn anything from my story, let it be this. Don't hurt someone you love. Don't ever make them feel like they aren't enough. Story 23. At a very low point in my life, I found myself in a deep depression, feeling like I was constantly in a state of crisis. During that time, I met someone online who became a friend I could confide in. As we talked more, I realized that the feelings I once had for my ex had faded, and I had developed feelings for this new friend. I ended my relationship to pursue a connection with this new person, but the romance quickly fizzled out. That experience gave me the space I needed to focus on my healing and take time to rest and reflect. Since then, I've worked hard on myself, learning how to better manage my emotions and be more open and honest with myself and others. I've also been focusing on setting healthy boundaries, both in how I treat myself and in how I allow others to treat me. It's been a challenging journey, but one I'm grateful for. Story 24. After I had my first child, my ex-partner cheated on me, and I couldn't forgive or forget what happened. While I didn't cheat to get back at him, I did end up in a situation where I was unfaithful. The person I ended up with is now my husband, but the story goes way back. We first met when we were 14, and he was my first love. During his younger years, he didn't want to be in a relationship with me because he knew he wasn't ready for it. We stayed in touch over the years, but nothing ever came of it until after my breakup. After my ex cheated on me, my current husband reached out to me, and he shared that he had always had feelings for me, which was a huge surprise because I had felt the same way about him for years. At that time, we didn't act on it, but a few years later, my relationship with my ex had deteriorated. I felt unhappy, unable to forgive him, and ready to move on. But my ex wasn't open to a breakup. Around that time, my current husband messaged me again, and we started talking more. Even though we lived in different states, we spent a lot of time talking and planning how I could move back home and file for divorce. Eventually, I made a couple of trips to see him while I was getting everything in order. I felt conflicted but knew that I had already communicated my desire for a divorce, even though my ex wasn't accepting it. After moving back and finalizing everything with my divorce, we became officially together, and I haven't looked back. I love my husband deeply, and he loves me just as much. It's been a long and complicated journey, but we're happy to finally be together now. Story 25. Looking back, I realized my actions were driven by insecurities, immaturity, and a lack of self-awareness. I have no one to blame but myself. She was a wonderful partner, loving and caring. Like anyone, we both had things about each other we could have changed, but when I reflect on our time together, I remember it with warmth. The time we spent together was a beautiful chapter in my life. It's easy to say now that I would have made different choices, but I'm not entirely sure. I feel like I still have a lot of growing to do. Maybe that's why, at 40, I choose to remain single. The fear of emotional pain and heartache hold me back from opening up to others, and for now, that's where I stand. Story 26. I was in a relationship with a guy, and at first everything seemed perfect. We met when I was in my mid-20s, and he was in his early 30s. I made it clear from the beginning that I didn't want children, and he agreed. As time passed, we moved in together and got engaged, but then he started talking about having kids. I reiterated that I still didn't want children, but he said he had changed his mind and wanted to have kids with me. I reached out to family, friends, and even therapists for advice, but everyone kept telling us how great we were together and how we'd be amazing parents. They said I would change my mind once I was pregnant or when I held a baby for the first time. They reassured me that babies bring families together and that I'd eventually come around. I saw a couple of therapists who wanted to explore why I didn't want kids, but the truth was I just didn't. It wasn't something I ever envisioned for myself. Despite what everyone said, I still felt pressure. People often told us how good we were with their kids and how I'd be a great mom and he'd be a great dad. It was hard to ignore these opinions, but deep down, I knew I wasn't ready for that life. I needed a way out, a clear reason to end things. So I made a decision that was hurtful and wrong. I slept with a colleague. When I got home, I told my fiancé what had happened. He wanted to work things out, and we ended up having a screaming match. I repeated that I didn't want kids, and he insisted I would change my mind. I was firm with him, telling him I wouldn't change my mind and that I couldn't guarantee I wouldn't make more mistakes in the future. We ended the relationship that day. The pain I caused him was overwhelming, but I couldn't continue in the relationship with that constant pressure to have children. 15 years later, we still touch base from time to time. We care about each other, but I still don't have children, and I don't regret that decision. He has been in a couple of long-term relationships since then. About a year ago, he called me, and I've never heard him sound so broken. He told me that he's infertile now. It's too late for us, but if we had known that back then and hadn't been under so much pressure, who knows what could have been. Story 27. I made a huge mistake, and I owned up to it because I still cared deeply for her. I accepted the consequences of my actions because I knew I deserved them. Was I unhappy? Maybe. Was I afraid of the future? Definitely. Who isn't? But did I hurt someone else because I wasn't mature enough to face my problems and talk things through? Yes, I failed her in that way. Was I feeling overwhelmed from the years of supporting her? Perhaps, but when you love someone, that's what you do. I should have been more responsible and open about what I was feeling instead of taking the coward's way out. I regret it every single day. I've been living with that guilt for over a year now. I despise myself for what happened, and I may never fully forgive myself for it. Honestly, I don't even know if I could ever get into a relationship again. I thought I had grown past that phase of my life where I thought I needed new experiences, but it turns out I hadn't. The hardest part is knowing that she told me I could have come to her and talked about my feelings. Instead, I kept them to myself, and in doing so, I destroyed what we had. Don't make the same mistake I did. She probably will never see this, but I still want to apologize. I know words don't fix what I broke, but at this point, that's all I have left to give. Looking back, I probably should have let her take both cats instead of separating them. They were happy together, but now it's just another thing I wish I had handled better. Story 28. After having children, particularly with special needs, I found myself living an hour away for several months at a time. Communication with my ex-partner became strained, and I found myself desperately asking for support. He visited only a handful of times while I was taking care of our child, who was sick at the time. During that period, I received attention from others who seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being and my child's. Our relationship had already been challenging before then, with us sleeping in separate beds, barely talking, and working opposite shifts. Over time, things continued to deteriorate. I deeply regret the choices I made and have learned valuable lessons from this experience. I would never want to find myself in a similar situation again. Story 29. I was in an emotionally abusive marriage. My ex-husband made me feel like I was wrong and unworthy in every way during the 3 years we were together. It wasn't until someone else saw value in me that I finally felt like I mattered. I clung to that validation, and eventually things became physical, but I think it was more about needing to feel seen and appreciated rather than anything else. This happened during the last 6 months of our marriage. For most of our relationship, I was loyal to him, even though he constantly reminded me that no one else could tolerate my presence. So, when someone else not only tolerated me, but valued me, I couldn't help but hold on to that. Looking back, the marriage was unhealthy, and I'm grateful to be out of it. It's been almost 10 years, but I'm still working through the emotional scars of that relationship. I've never been unfaithful before or since, and that's something I regret deeply. Story 30. I don't feel the need to explain myself, but what I will say is this. I made many mistakes in the past. I hurt several people by being unfaithful, and for a long time, I convinced myself it was okay for various reasons. I told myself they deserved someone better and that I was doing them a favor by pushing them away. Looking back, I realized how wrong that mentality was. Everything changed when I met someone I truly loved. I made a mistake while we were apart, and for the first time, I felt genuine guilt. It was the kind of guilt that eats away at you. I couldn't ignore it, so I confessed to him that same night, even though I knew it could end our relationship. But for once, I accepted responsibility for my actions, knowing there was no excuse. I cheated because I was selfish. That was a turning point for me. I started therapy, and I stopped lying to myself and others. I began to understand the impact of my past actions and the importance of owning up to them. Eventually, my relationship ended because of the damage I caused, and it was heartbreaking. Even though we are no longer together, I still care for him deeply, and I regret how things turned out. That pain is a reminder to never repeat the mistakes I made before. He deserves the best, and I hope he finds happiness. I'm still in therapy, working on myself, and learning to find peace with the truth. We all make mistakes. We're human. That doesn't mean we're doomed to be defined by them forever. If you truly want to change, it's possible. To those who may think that every person who cheats is beyond redemption, I ask you to reflect on your own actions as well. We all have our flaws, and we're all just doing the best we can, even if our pasts are imperfect. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.